seem outrageous, but trust me, it's an underestimation. I want you to stop, clear your mind, and be open to a reality happening right now that might be new to you. The global population growth is outpacing the rate at which the church is reaching people by a growing margin. As an example, India alone grows by the equivalent of Canada's population every 18 months, and only 5% of India lives in areas reached with the gospel. Roughly 4 out of every 10 people on the planet not only have never heard the good news, but they don't even have access to it. There's no local pastor, no Christian radio, no Alpha group, no church. It's like Paul writes to the church in Rome. How can someone believe in something they've never heard? And how will they hear if there's no one to tell them? So now what? I get it. You're already tackling so many critical needs in your community and around the world. Compassion cannot sleep. But we have an opportunity to reach the unreached at scale if together we focus on what could be the biggest domino. The one region that may present the greatest opportunity of being a gateway to reach the entire world. It comes down to the exponential power of numbers. 1 out of every 4 people alive right now live in South Asia. That's 1.9 billion people and over 1.8 billion unreached lives. That's a big number to wrap your head around, so let me just put it this way. If you set a timer right now for 1.8 million seconds, it would stop in 20 days. But if you set it for 1.8 billion seconds, it will stop in 57 years. Reaching just 1% of this region would be the equivalent of reaching more than the entire population of Hong Kong, New Zealand, Montreal, and Ireland combined. 50% of the world's remaining unreached people groups live in this region, along with 40% of the world's poorest people. And it's also one of the most persecuted places on the planet. The church in the global south, specifically South Asia, will play a disproportionate role in the evangelization of the world. Will we join them, support them, encourage them? Reaching this region is a massive gateway to reaching the world and a critical priority of the global church. It will require us to be all in. It will demand full-scale mobilization of our churches and communities. It will require a historic move of God's Spirit. It will come at a cost, but it will be worth it. And over the next 10 years, we are partnering with South Asians, not just to reach South Asia, but for South Asia to reach the world. It is well within reach to plant 50,000 churches, baptizing 500,000 multiplying disciples, making this one of the greatest evangelistic movements that we may ever see by 2030.
Keep those images in your mind. I'm moved every time I see that video. And it's wonderful to be here at Okotoks Alliance Church. I don't think I've ever spoken here. And I've certainly never seen your beautiful building. I was sitting over there thinking, I love a sanctuary with natural light. So I commend you, whoever did the planning of this sanctuary. It's really beautiful. And I'm also thrilled to be with you, to be with a church that prioritizes, gives some time in the church calendar to speak to God's heart for the nations. My heart resonates with that. Let me introduce myself. I'm known as a woman of 3 passions. So by passion, I mean that which, on the one hand, that which gets me out of bed in the morning. When I have to make decisions, if it's in line with one of my passions, it's easier to get out of bed. But as is on the screen for the first passion, it's also that which means more than anything else to me. So passion number 1 for me is the millions in our world who, through no fault of their own, have never heard of Jesus. I'm passionate about unreached people groups. Now, allow this professor, missiology, missions professor, to just take a moment to explain what I mean by an unreached people group. In Matthew 28, when Jesus said, "Go and make disciples of all the nations," he was not speaking as we do about nations or countries. There are 195 of those in our world. But he was using the Greek word ethnos. I could also give you a little lesson in Greek, but when we think about ethnic groups, we're thinking of groups of people that have a distinctive language and a distinctive culture. And in our world, there are 16,000 of those. An unreached people group is an ethnic group among whom are less than 2% believers. So few believers that without help from the outside, they may never see the church established among them. And I'm so thankful that the Christian Missionary Alliance has, over the last 20 years, begun to prioritize unreached people groups. Think back to that video you just saw a few minutes ago, that vast area of South Asia. In the Alliance, we're calling it Gateway for security reasons. If you were there at General Assembly in 2018, as I was, I can never forget how, as a body of churches, we spent almost a whole afternoon in a discernment process, asking God if He was leading us into this very difficult part of our world, this vast, unreached area of South Asia. 18 months ago, just before COVID really closed us down as far as public events, I was talking with one of our denominational leaders who had just returned from a vision trip, sort of like Caleb and the spies, going into the promised land. And they were looking into this area we called Gateway, which we had discerned at Assembly as a denomination we should enter. This is not actually a new place for us to serve, because for many, many decades, we were in the south part of Gateway. But for us, it's a re-entry in that we're going into the north part of the country, where there are more than 2,000 unreached people groups, and where extremists of the primary religion, you will understand my veiled language here this morning, there are extremists who call the shots, no pun intended there, because it is a violent place to live. And as my colleague talked with me about Gateway, he used 3 words which I want to put on the screen here this morning. Number 1, he said, Gateway is big. 1.9 billion people. Can you get your mind around that? That's 1/4 of the world's population. And the addition of 20+ million every year. I can hardly grasp that sometimes when I think about it. The population of Canada increases in Gateway every 18 months. And by 2025, it will be the largest country population-wise of the world. The second word that our colleague from the Alliance used was the word complex. I've already said there's over 2,000 unreached people groups, 2,000 ethnic groups that need help from the outside if the church is going to be established. We're talking about the birthplace of Hinduism, Sikhism, Jainism, Buddhism. And you've heard about the caste system, I know, with Brahmins on the top and the untouchables on the bottom. We think in terms of 7 or 8 castes in that continent. But each of those castes is subdivided into a complex of 25,000 castes, which residents there grasp. We can hardly get our minds around it. It's a massively complex part of the world. It is also a very poor, my colleague used the word massively poor, part of the world. 1/3 of the world's extreme poor live in Gateway. And by poor, he spoke of the people living on $1.25 a day total. So because of its sheer bigness and complexity, Gateway is one of the world's most unreached places on the planet. And I can tell you, it is going to be a hard place for us to serve. But listen to the vision. I put it on one of the slides here, the vision of the CNMA for Gateway during the next 10 years. Their vision is to partner. Notice that word partner, it's very significant. We ourselves, Westerners, Gateway has experienced a lot of colonization. Our vision speaks of going to partner with the nationals in planting 50,000 churches. That our vision includes winning and discipling 500,000 believers. And if each church adds just 10 believers in the next 10 years, we will have reached more than 1 million people. I say that and realize it's a drop in the bucket when you look at Gateway. 6 months ago, a young couple from Calgary, some of you have met Jerome and Morgan. That's not their real name, their real names. And their sons with them, they flew from Calgary to Gateway. The first Canadians from our denomination who have been assigned to live in South Asia. They're not strangers to South Asia. They've lived there before. But they are now our point persons on the ground. I know they've had conversations with some of you. I probably speak with them every other day in a secure way. But I want to tell you this morning, they are living in a hard place. They live in the capital city and have mentioned to me that their prime minister doesn't support what they're doing in Gateway, obviously. They don't support anyone. The government doesn't support anyone who is not aligned with the prominent religion. I want to add, it's also technologically advanced. Gateway is, even more so than China. And it's one reason we use very veiled language when we speak publicly. They know who we are as Christians. And the Prime Minister is asking nationals all over the world to, and maybe some even here in Canada, to report back to them on what is being planned for their country. Which leads me then to talk about my second passion. And that is the millions in our world who suffer intensely today because they are willing to be known as followers of Jesus. I love the persecuted church. I was born in southern China just as the regime of Mao Zedong came to power in 1949. So you don't have to do the math, I'm 72. And my family were house prisoners for those first few years until that day in 1952 when Mao forced 1,000 missionaries to leave China. And my family was among them. We escaped with the clothes on our backs. Perhaps that's why I have such a passion for refugees and immigrants. We left with the clothes on our backs and hitchhiked our way across southern China in order to leave the country. And the church in China entered an unprecedented era, an era of unprecedented suffering, which, even though many Chinese deny it to me, it exists today. And so I grew up with a passion for the millions in our world who suffer because they are willing to be called followers of Jesus. And Gateway today is becoming a place of persecution. Christians are persecuted. We don't hear a lot about it because Gateway tries to present itself to the world as a progressive, democratic nation. And so listen with that reality in your mind when you see the news at night about the way that COVID has ravished the country. It may surprise you to know that the Prime Minister of Gateway has a registered not-for-profit that is specifically training nationals to persecute anyone who isn't of the primary religion. Obviously, that includes Christians, primarily Christians and Muslims. And they've already trained 1 million people to do so. The goal of the head of state is to see the entire country, in fact, the entire world, follow the primary religion. I spent the best years of my life, I often say, in ministry to the underground church in Eastern Europe and Central Europe during the communist era. That was a long time ago. And to a degree, Central and Eastern Europe is free now, but living with another kind of restriction. Some of you knew me back then, a few of you that I've spoken with. And for you, perhaps in those years, it was your introduction to the suffering church. A few of you were children, and I run into you. You've heard my stories. And every time I run into people who were children in the 80s, one of their first questions, they don't remember me, but they remember my stories. And they'll ask me, they'll say, "Have you written a book yet?" And the answer is yes. I'm here this morning, able to have available this book that I have written, that your pastor showed you a copy of it. The book is about those years in Romania. And since I'm here with you on this weekend, I'm able to offer it to you for a better price than you would get online. I want to go back to talk about Jerome and Morgan, because the book that I've written, when I'm in discussion with Jerome and Morgan and see how they function in this place where the church is persecuted, it takes me back to those years in the 80s when I was in Romania. They were very dark years. The dictator Nicolae Ceausescu made life very difficult for believers. And just the 2 years before COVID hit our country, I spent many months in Romania interviewing pastors from that era 30 years ago, talking to my former students, because as I thought back before I wrote the book, I guess I needed to validate that really they were as difficult, the years were as difficult as I remembered them to be, and they confirmed that to me. Romania in the 1980s was a hard place. And my book is about what it will require of our church, our denomination, the churches in Eastern and Central Europe, if they are going to bring the good news to hard places. I think that as we look further afield from Eastern Europe into places like Gateway and North Africa and difficult places even in the western part of the hemisphere, I think Romanians have something significant to tell us about what we need to consider as we go into these hard places. I tell people that, in a sense, the easy places in our world have been reached. If God should call someone from this congregation, as he has called Jerome and Morgan and Ian and Rebecca and the international workers present with us today, if he should call us to any place in the world, I believe now, to serve with our denomination, it will be a hard place. Jerome and Morgan are an unusual couple. I hope you'll pick up one of their prayer cards from my table in the lobby. And I think about the world into which they were catapulted 6 months ago. The way that COVID has... Morgan writes me texts, and she says when she goes out in the morning, she can smell the burning of bodies. They don't know what to do. So many are dying every day. They're burning their bodies. But let me encourage you. I also got an amazing update from Gateway recently, saying how that God has, in the last few months, drawn over 500,000 people, unreached people, to himself. It's a movement that feels like it's unstoppable, a movement of the global church. And you here at Okotoks Alliance are a part of that. Do you remember Christ's commission in Acts 1:8 when he said, "You will be my witnesses"? And as the disciples heard the commission from the risen Lord that day, I wonder if they heard what I hear every time I hear the Great Commission. because the New Testament Greek word for witness, on the screen, the word says, "You will be my witnesses." Christ was probably speaking in Aramaic, but it was recorded in our Bible in Greek. And the Greek word for witness is martus, which is the Greek word from which we get the word martyr. So when Jesus gave that great commission, I hear him saying, "You will be my martyrs, you will be my witnesses." We usually think of a martyr as one who offers up his life for the sake of the kingdom. We think of the apostles and Stephen, and we think of church fathers burned at the stake. But not every witness will die. And as I interviewed so many of the pastors from the years I worked there, I often realized I was in the presence of true witnesses. And so I've kind of adopted the definition that Richard Wormbrand uses for a martyr. Many of you have seen the recent movie on his life. And he defines a martyr as one who sacrifices something important to further the kingdom of God. And you will read stories in my book about people in Romania and in Russia who witnessed to the gospel. They made great sacrifices. And I know that recently some of our denominational leaders were in Gateway, and they were dialoguing with some of the pastors who are now in training in this massive project that we have undertaken with the Nationals. And they asked them through translation, they said, "What are your ministry goals, your ministry dreams?" And the men and women immediately responded with that one word, persecution. And he thought, well, the translator didn't translate it right. He said, "No, I'm wondering, what are your ministry dreams?" They said, "No, we dream of persecution because we know that when persecution arrives, we know that revival is not far behind." I've sprinkled through my book the story of Pastor Mircea from Romania. I visited with him in Romania as I was doing the research for the book. And as we sat talking, he said, "You know, Miriam, there's something you don't know about your trips here to our city. Every time you left before the revolution, when you would leave after teaching the people in our city, the secret police would come to the door and take me away to their headquarters and begin to interrogate me. And when I wouldn't inform on you, tell them what you were really doing here, they would begin to beat me." He said they often beat me on the bottoms of my feet because they knew how sensitive the bottoms of our feet are. And he said that the last time this happened, before the revolution, they beat me so much that my feet actually exploded. And then they released me and said, "You can go home." And that involved walking on a gravel pathway for more than 1 kilometer. And I said to Mircea, "But you didn't die. But I think of you as a martyr, as a witness, because you sacrificed many times something very important for the sake of the kingdom." My third passion, and the one I want most to address while I'm here with you, is the next generation. The generation that God is going to raise up to take the good news to the ends of the earth, to hard places, to people who've never heard of Jesus. I find it hard now as a retired international worker. But in recent weeks, God has given me in recent months, he's given me a fresh vision of what my role could be in the outreach that we are looking at for places like Gateway. I have switched roles to being an advocate. As a retired international worker, I'm always asking, who's going to replace me and a ton of others who signed up in my day to take the gospel to the ends of the world? And I'm praying that God will raise up teenagers and millennials and young adults who will hear God's call and fill our ranks when we are dead and gone from the scene. Perhaps the next wave of international workers will include professionals in midlife, people who can retire early perhaps and go, and it will be their profession that gets them into a country. Maybe that will happen this morning as I speak. I watched a webinar recently by the president of Operation Mobilization. He said 80% of the world's population live where missionary activity is illegal. And our way of getting into those countries is going to have to change. He commented that 3 billion of our world's 7.9 billion people will be born, live, and die without ever hearing, without ever meeting a follower of Jesus. I want to turn your thoughts to the passage that our pastor read. I often get to speak from this passage when I'm speaking about missions, and it became even more meaningful to me when I was writing my book. Let me read a few of the verses that your pastor read before I came to the pulpit. God, in the presence of Jesus Christ, is about to invade the villages and towns of Palestine. And here's what he says as he addresses that first wave of new workers. He tells them, the harvest is plentiful, the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest. We can all do that. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. And then he continued with some very unsettling words. Listen to them. He said, "Go, I am sending you out like lambs among wolves." Yes, it is a call for workers, but so often we quit after that first call for workers and the call for us to pray for more workers. Because Christ goes on to clarify what kind of witnesses will be needed if the hard places are going to be reached. Can you get your mind around this? He says, "I am sending you out like lambs among wolves." This was the Good Shepherd speaking. In John 10, he called himself the Good Shepherd. And yet he says, "I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves." What good shepherd would send his flock into the middle of a pack of wolves? What chance does the lamb have of surviving, let alone converting the wolves? Unless the lambs are totally dependent on the Good Shepherd. It is an unsettling call, but that's how Jesus sent out those first workers. And I think he still sends workers in the same way. Most missions don't make this kind of demand on the workers they send. Normally, we move our families to safer neighborhoods. We choose secure homes in the neighborhoods where we move them. We stockpile food for a rainy day. And so what Jesus says is somewhat counterintuitive. But those verses, that statement of the Good Shepherd, were ringing in my ears 6 months ago as I prayed over Jerome and Morgan as they were on their way, knowing a bit of the situation to which they were going with their 3 children. It is a sobering picture. A lamb doesn't have a lot of chance of survival apart from the absolute dependence on the Good Shepherd. Over and over in the Gospels, Jesus told his followers, if you come after me, you have to take up a cross. And crosses spoke of death. As I've already said, he doesn't always call every witness to literal martyrdom, but he does call us to take up a cross and in doing so, become a witness. But the lambs among wolves lifestyle, as I look at it and as I mentor new recruits that are going abroad, I say to them, it really means letting go of everything but your dependence on the Good Shepherd. Those were the words that I shared with Morgan 2 or 3 days before they left. Let me suggest some of the things we talked about, she and I, as we talked about the lambs among wolves lifestyle that Jesus was taking them into. And I said to them, Jesus is talking to us about letting go, first of all, of possessions. Most of us think of that instantly when we think about international workers going. It's kind of the history we have of being an international worker. And at some level, you have to let go of possessions. And I'm struck, I'm glad that your pastor read verse 4, because we often quit before we get to that part. Because Jesus said to them, do not take a purse or a bag or sandals. Do not greet anyone on the road. Everything about this speaks to me about the ability of international workers to travel light. I mean, they couldn't even take a purse in which to put some extra cash or a credit card when things get difficult, if there's an emergency. Absolutely nothing to fall back on. It's a picture of total reliance on the Good Shepherd. And I can picture those first missionaries going from town to town, perhaps not even knowing which home of a local they would have dinner in that night. And I know it was probably hard for the locals to provide dinner for these hungry workers. I guess the reason I know that is because for those years I was in Romania, it was the Christians who fed me after our teaching sessions. And I knew that because they were known as pokaite, they were the repenters. That's the pejorative term. It's still used for Christians in that country. They're repenters. You're just a repenter. And because they were repenters, their food ration cards issued by the government were greatly reduced. And I used to say, how are you able to feed us? And they smiled and they said, well, we have a kind of Christian mafia. They would pool their resources so that I could eat. And I would often tell them about the church in Canada, our denomination, who I know many of you sacrifice to be a part of fueling the Global Advance Fund so that people like Jerome and Morgan get their monthly stipend to pay the expenses in Gateway. And I know sometimes you probably wonder where your resources will come from so that you can make that monthly commitment. I'm mentoring a handful of new recruits who have felt the call of God to go into the harvest fields. And nowadays in the Christian Missionary Alliance, they have to raise some of their support. Perhaps you don't know that. And for a new worker, this is really a challenge. And I remember saying to Jerome and Morgan, don't view raising your funds as a humiliating task. Yes, it's very humbling, but it's not humiliating. It's an honor for you, it's an honor for the church, because what it says to all of us is that this is not the work of Jerome and Morgan. This is the work of the body of Christ. It put a new light on this task that they had to deal with. Possessions are not the only place where we have to relinquish our rights. The second that I often think of is the giving up of a right to an occupation. What about giving up the right to a respected profession? When Jesus called his followers, they were all busy, employed men, and Christ called them to follow him. And I know that in releasing the occupation that they had currently been involved with, it implicated their children and their wives. In the Gospels, as I read the stories of the apostles, I'm often going back in my mind to the life they lived before Christ called them. I write very personally about the release of an occupation in my book, when Christ called me to be an international worker. I remember when I would come home on home assignment, and people would look at me and say, we've got to get you ready to go back. Your winter coat looks like it needs replacing. And they would take me out to buy a new winter coat, and at the point of payment, out of their pocket would come their credit card. And going through my mind was this thought, I have a very good education. I could pay my own way if I were earning my income. But for some reason, Christ has called me and the international workers you have here with you today to release that right to a profession, an occupation that pays the way. It's not a humiliating lifestyle. It's a very humbling way to live. And it means we're all in this together. God is saying, perhaps to some, even in this day, I want you to leave your occupation and go to a limited access nation where it is your profession that will get you into the country today. That's the case with Jerome and Morgan. There's a third thing that I think we have to relinquish, and that is our right to personal security, safety. What a crazy world we live in. And I'm asked that question all the time. Is it safe where you're sending new workers? My gut level reaction is to say, when is it ever safe to follow Christ? But that isn't very satisfying when you're talking to a new recruit. And it's certainly not very satisfying when you're talking to the parents of new recruits. In the West, we don't usually think in terms of the possibility of dying for Christ or dying at the hands of violent people. In Gateway, it is a distinctive possibility. Just in the last few weeks, actually, somebody here in Okotoks sent me an email about a young boy, a family in the city, very near to where Jerome and Morgan live. And recently, an entire family has decided to follow Jesus. And the entire family has asked to be baptized. Not long before the baptism, terrorists broke into their home and poured acid all over the 9-year-old child. And he had terrible burns to his body. Can you imagine the impact that has on workers in that part of the world? I remember the tears that the parents of Jerome and Morgan shed at their commissioning from First Alliance in Calgary 6 months ago. I spoke with the mother last night. I reminded her of her tears. And she said, but oh, Miriam, they are such good tears. She said, we wouldn't pull them back from Gateway for anything because they are fulfilling the call of God on their lives. The fourth thing I want to mention is that Jesus may ask you to give up life itself. I've already referenced that. But return with me to the Mount of Ascension, where the disciples of Jesus heard him say, you will be my witnesses. And I'm sure they heard him say, you will be my martus, my martyrs. Early Christians knew what that word meant, and they had relinquished their right to life itself and lived in dependence on the Good Shepherd. And as I travel around Canada, I see God laying his hands on people whom he's calling to be new workers. I think about some people who were born in Gateway, so you know who I'm thinking of. And they moved to Canada. They emigrated because they would have a better life here. And they are hearing the call of God to give up the life they have in Canada and return to be a part, to work with the nationals of whom they're a part in Gateway. It may indeed involve giving up life itself, because that word witnesses, martyr, implies suffering and sacrifice and the possibility of death. Interesting, isn't it, that tradition tells us that all but the Apostle John, out of the 11 apostles, only the Apostle John died of natural causes. The others died martyrs' deaths. As I close today, I want to ask the question, what does this verse imply for each of us here today and for those of you listening online? Is this lambs among wolves lifestyle expected only of the Rebecca and Ians or the Jerome and Morgans, and you think of the international workers you know? Or is it in some way a part of we who are the senders? I would like to suggest that it is expected of those who see themselves as Christ's witnesses, wanting to live in full obedience with the Great Commission. For those of us who stay here, we need to find a way we can fulfill that calling, to live as lambs among wolves, totally dependent on the Good Shepherd. I remember a few weeks ago when I was trying to help Jerome and Morgan, raise the funds that are needed. Remember, I see myself as their advocate. And God put in my heart to approach a well-to-do dentist in Calgary, who I knew has had some good returns on investments. And in fear and cringing with fear and apprehension, I approached him. And he responded. He responded to the idea of getting behind this call. I want to tell you from experience that something happens when you willingly enter into the call to live as lambs among wolves. I know by experience that when you surrender everything and willingly live in dependence on the Good Shepherd, two things are accomplished. First of all, there is a confidence for the messenger. People ask me all the time, were you afraid? Weren't you afraid in Eastern Europe when you were traveling under the radar of the secret police? And I say to them, you know what? It's interesting. When you live in dependence on the Good Shepherd, you have a confidence as the messenger. And the second thing that happens is that the message has unbelievable authority when the message comes from one who is living under the authority of the Good Shepherd. I want to just close now with a story from Romania. It's one of the stories that didn't make it into the book, but Pastor Joseph's story is one I heard in Romania. He's now in his 80s, and he lived through those brutal years of the communist era. In the late 1960s, he was freed by the government to go to Oxford to get a doctorate. And in 72, he was ready to return to his church in Romania. And his fellow students at Oxford said to him, Joseph, what chances do you have of successfully implementing your plan in Romania? And Joseph told me when he told us, a group of us, this story, he said, that's such a Western way of thinking. Chances of success? I was just thinking about obedience. And he said, but I did turn to God and ask him that question. And God's answer was from the very passage I've spoken from this morning. He said, Joseph, I am sending you out like a lamb among the wolves. That's how I send you, totally defenseless and without a reasonable sense of or hope of success. If you're willing to go like that, then go. If you're not willing to go like that, then don't go. And Joseph said, I went back to Romania. And within a very short time of his return, the harassment and interrogations began again. And one day during interrogation, the officer threatened to kill him. He screamed at Joseph. He said, I have the power to kill you. And Joseph's response to him was, Sir, your supreme weapon is killing. My supreme weapon is dying. He said, you know that my sermons are all over this country. It was the day of cassette tapes. And he said, if you kill me, it will be like sprinkling those cassettes with my blood. He said, everyone who listens to those cassettes will say, I'd better listen. This man sealed his testimony with his blood. He said to the officer, go ahead, kill me. I win the supreme victory. He sent me home, Joseph said. For Joseph, he realized that for years he had been a cautious, low-keyed Christian with very little invested in the kingdom, really. And he said, and now that I wanted to die, the officer wouldn't oblige. He said, I'd tried to save my life, and now that I wanted to give it, he didn't want to cooperate. So this morning, I'm asking you in closing, I invite you to the question it's the question around which I frame my book. It's the question I'm asking us here this morning. And this is the question, what can we relinquish to see the kingdom of God advanced in hard places in our world? How can I enter into what it will take to see the inbreaking of the kingdom of God in places like Gateway and North Africa and other places we will hear about today? My question for all of us is, what sacrifice is God calling me to make for the sake of the kingdom in this world today?